As my colleague David Parker said earlier, Labor is supporting this and commending the government for pushing this through. The acceptance of the amendment to the International Finance Agreement Act 1961, so that New Zealand will be one of the founding members of the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Being a founding member obviously has some advantages, and those advantages have been spoken about at some length earlier. Perhaps more importantly and more strategically is that New Zealand is a member of the Asia-Pacific region. We have huge and growing interests in this area. 6 out of our 10 top markets are located in this area, and with the expansion obviously of China and of Japan too, but also of Vietnam, Malaysia, we are seeing growth here that is very important for our economic welfare into the future as well. So being part of this agreement, sir, was important, and I think that getting in as being one of the first countries, the first Western country to be part of this, sent a very good signal and a strong signal about our commitment to the region and the way that we see our future. As the last speaker was talking about this, the real demands for infrastructure development in the region is huge. Even the Asian Development Bank put the needs at around about $8 trillion, and the IMF talked about it as being about $1 trillion per year. And most of that, 51% in fact, was estimated to be needed in the electricity sector. But not only in that, but in rail, in road, in a whole range of other infrastructure areas as well. So there is real demand within the Asia region which underpins its further development and the welfare of its people to be able to provide those basic services that enable them to develop and, by rights, create the markets for our goods as well. So it's a beneficial cycle that we're trying to create here, that both it helps and enhances the welfare and the prosperity of those people living in many of those countries, but at the same time there is a benefit to New Zealand as well. And that demand and the way that this bank is going to be able to meet that demand was well set out by Alan Bollard, a very well-respected former official from New Zealand who now serves in the APEC Secretariat, and he spoke of the real advantages of this bank coming into operation. Now, it didn't have the easiest of births, and there was some pushback, particularly from the United States, who I think rather unwisely looked at this as being an extension of China's influence in the region, which to some degree we admit to, in a sense that China is one of the big stakeholders in this bank and is putting billions, by far the biggest shareholder in the bank, and putting billions into it. But actually, why shouldn't it be? In a sense, when you look at the other big Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF, the World Bank, the Asia Development Bank, they are products of the Second World War, and this is a changed world now where China does hold a greater degree of influence around the world and greater economic clout as well. The important thing, I think, about the bank is, and particularly China's involvement, is that by being in on the ground floor as we have been, and particularly the influence of John Whitehead, another of our excellent officials and extraordinarily well qualified and respected, him being there has enabled us to be at the table when the principles and the values and the working procedures of the bank have been set up, so that we can be confident that the bank is doing and is going to be seen to be both transparent and have best practice And that has been perhaps one of New Zealand's greatest contributions to the future of this bank. So although China will have 20 to 30% of the voting rights on the bank, alongside it will sit at least 50 other countries. And as Dr. Shane Reedy just mentioned, New Zealand will be there with a very modest input into the bank, a very modest voting right, yet it will have actually quite a lot of influence in the way that the bank operates and benefit to New Zealand as well. So we put in, as has been said, about $145 million putting up capital over the next 5 years. So it's a relatively modest amount. We also put forward about 461 million New Zealand dollars as callable capital, although we have to acknowledge that, as far as I'm aware anyway, with the various shareholdings we've had in international operations and institutions around the world, I don't think we've ever been asked to, our contribution has never been called up in the past. So I think it's a pretty rare possibility. So the other thing that I want to touch on, and then David Parker mentioned as well, is the fact that environmental and social impacts are in this the bank's operation as well, so that the rather disastrous big power projects and environmental projects that have taken place in the past, at least they will be mitigated against, and we will be able to see some of those large, inappropriate type of projects having to address the environmental and social impacts before they will be funded by this bank. Sir, there were no submissions from the public to the Select Committee on this. In some ways, I'm not quite sure what that was, perhaps because it looked like it was a bank, it was a financial institution, and perhaps people weren't interested. But I think it is a very significant part of New Zealand's contribution. And it comes in as standing alongside China, who was the main proponent of the bank. It stands alongside our other firsts with China, starting off in 1972 with our formal recognition of China, and most recently in 2008 with the first free trade agreement, well before any of our, certainly the Australians across the ditch, we actually got in there well before them and had our first trade agreement, which of course happened under Phil Goff's reign as the trade minister. Sir, there is no doubt that the bank is responding to a need and a demand. As I said, the infrastructure demands from right across Asia are enormous, they're immense, and we need to be able to be sure that they are met. To repeat one more time, there are certainly the countries across Asia, and I was in one this week in Myanmar, and looking at their infrastructure, the demands that Asia requires for infrastructure are immense. By meeting those demands, by meeting electricity, transport, railways, all of those types of infrastructure will mean that people's lives will be significantly uplifted, will provide the basis for further economic development, and that economic development will trigger more demand for goods that New Zealand is able to produce. So, sir, I see that this is a positive step for New Zealand. I was pleased that the government moved quickly on in support of the bank, that it got in on the ground floor, that it got somebody as illustrious as John Whitehead to be there at the table to make sure that this bank upholds the best practices that's possible to have. And sir, I think this is a good investment and something that New Zealanders will recoup in terms of our both influence and our economic ability and our potential into the future. So I commend the government and once again congratulate them for moving ahead in this and obtaining Labor's support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.